Welcome back to the Boost Plant channel. Today is an exciting day because we're launching a brand new build series on this UNS 90S. We're going to show you how we create a classic Iwagumi every step of the way, all the way from the hardscaping to the planting to adding fish, shrimp, and snails to the maintenance that we do. So in today's video, we'll cover the basic setup, which will include the hardscaping process as well as the planting. Stay tuned for future videos for updates to see what fish and shrimp we add and lots more. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification. Now without further ado, let's get started with today's step-by-step aquascaping tutorial. So let's talk a little bit about the aquarium itself. This is the stunning UNS 90S. It's about 48 gallons, and as always with UNS glass, it features beautiful ultra clear aquarium glass for an uninterrupted view into the aquascape itself, and the stunning mitered edges for an unobstructed view into the corners of your scape. Illuminating our canvas is the Chihiro's RGB2, fully app customizable light. You can adjust the intensity, the composition of the RGB LEDs themselves, and that's mounted to the glass with the UNS hanging bars. Let's get started hardscaping. As with every great hardscape, we're going to start with the soil. We're using a generous amount of UNS contra soil to build up a nice base layer and slope things toward the back. After about 3.5 bags of soil were added, we used a paintbrush to slope it toward the back to create an enhanced sense of depth, which makes the aquarium look deeper than it actually is. Fortunately, with this UNS 90S, it has quite a bit of depth to begin with, so we have a ton of space to create something impactful and beautiful. Now let's get started with the hardscape of the Iwagumi. So Iwagumi translates to rock garden, and we've selected the beautiful ancient stone, which is known for very earthy tones with highlights of rust-colored streaks. So it should have a very natural look, and green plants will pop out really nicely in front of it. One of the hardest things to do when you're setting up your Iwagumi is place that first stone. This is called the mother stone and is often the most impactful stone in the layout. So what we're doing is selecting the largest ancient stone and finding the angle that works best and is the most interesting. However, in order to support the stone and give it a little extra height, we're adding a base layer of ancient stone to kind of support it up. Then the mother stone is placed on top of that, and by brushing some soil in the place, it'll look like the stone has existed there for all of time. This is a great tip. Whenever you're hardscaping, be sure to layer in additional soil to cover up any hardscape seams and make things look lived in. To the rear right-hand side of that stone, we're adding our secondary stone, which is a supporting stone, and it's going to further take the eye on the journey from back left to the front right of the tank. So we're angling it accordingly to find a really nice balance. In order to complete the left side, some additional stones are placed in front and to the left. This creates some more depth and makes things look a little bit more natural. Feel free to take your time when playing around this process. Pop a rock into your tank, walk away for a few hours, maybe live with it for a few days. If you want to really create an impactful hardscape, you need not rush it. Now it's time to create some balance. Because our left side is built up, we want to balance that out on the right. So we're pointing our rocks in the opposite direction of the left-hand rocks to add some harmony and take the eye on a little bit of a journey. So we've selected a beautiful stone that isn't quite as big as the primary mother stone, but still has some nice impact. And we're using smaller stones around that to support it. Finally, to complete the look and build up a little bit of a sense of scale, we're using tiny pieces of ancient stone, little pieces of rubble that we've created by crushing stones with a hammer. By adding these smaller stones, it helps establish a sense of scale and make your aquascape look more natural. Once you have a good hardscape, that's the foundation for everything, and the rest will sort of fall into place. One pro tip during the hardscaping process that we cannot recommend enough is to use a smartphone or a camera screen set up at eye level to really objectively evaluate the impact of your aquascape. Oftentimes your eyes can deceive you, or perhaps you're used to looking at the scape from higher up than you would if you were taking a photo. So having that camera monitor or that phone screen at eye level a few paces back will really give you an objective view as to what you're creating, and you can make modifications as necessary. So with most builds, at this point it would be time to plant. However, we've decided to run a dark start on this tank. And if you want to learn all about the benefits of the dark start, we have an entire video on the channel dedicated to that. That'll be linked down in the description below. But the basic concept of the dark start is while you're waiting to order plants, or if you want to go on vacation, you can shut the light off, run the filter, and cycle the filter without any lights. So this allows you to build up your colony of beneficial bacteria without any risk of plant melt because there are no plants in the tank yet, and without any risk of algae because algae needs light to grow. We're using the UNS Delta 120. This is an external canister filter, and now all Delta canister filters come with the Aquario Neo Media as well as the Aquario Neo pipes. So if we fast forward to 3 weeks later, we can turn the light back on and get this bad boy ready to plant. So the first thing we want to do is drain down some of the water because when you're planting, you're going to be elbow deep in the tank. You don't want to be splashing water onto the floor. So we're using the Canvy water change system to quickly drain a little bit of the water. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to enhance the soil a little bit with some Aquario root tabs. This isn't a necessary step per se, but we want to give our plants everything they need to thrive and give them the most advantage possible. So we're adding these throughout the soil, and it's going to give the roots of the plant some additional nutrients. With those in place, it's time to grab our plants. In this build, we're primarily working with tissue culture plants. The advantage of tissue culture plants is because they come from sterile laboratory conditions, they're snail-free, pest-free, algae-free. However, we are using one species of submerged plant that we'll introduce a little bit later. So first up in the planting process, we're going to plant our mid-ground highlights, and we're going to start with one of the smallest crypts there is in this hobby. This is Cryptocoryne Parva, and it stays super tiny and is a beautiful bright green. So we're adding this in strategic spots in the mid-ground. That's going to provide a little bit of height to contrast with the foreground and just add some nice little highlights and make all the spaces between the rocks look really natural. And next up, we'll take that process one step further by adding some more mid-ground plants. This time we're going to be working with Marsilea Angustfolia, and this is a beautiful plant that resembles a clover. Some of the leaves are brown, but don't be alarmed, this is natural. As the plant grows new leaves, they start off brown, and once they mature, they eventually become a beautiful bright green. So if you get a cup with brown, don't be alarmed, that's totally normal for the new young leaves. So we're planting this side by side with the Parva to kind of fill in those gaps between the rocks and build up a really nice mid-ground. Next, to kind of frame up our canvas, we're going to add our background plant, which we mentioned earlier is the only submerged plant we're using in this build. This is the beautiful Cyperus Helferi, and it's a classic aquarium plant that's been used since the dawn of aquascaping. This is a tall, grassy plant that will eventually grow tall enough where it can sort of drape over the sides of the tank and provide a real nice frame. So right now in its current form, that's hard to tell, but give this plant a few weeks to root, and before you know it, it'll be a lot taller and brighter. And it's totally normal to see some browning of these leaves. As you plant them and they adapt to your water conditions, those old leaves will sort of melt back and new healthy ones will grow in. If you find the browning leaves to be unsightly, feel free to just trim them off. So with those plants in place in the left and right corners of the tank, it's time to fill in our background and our remaining mid-ground space with a ton of Eleocharis Belem. Eleocharis Belem is a beautiful hair grass that is on the smaller side and stays really compact. So we're using this to kind of fill in the mid-ground and then work our way toward the background. So we'll have a beautiful contrast between this grassy plant, the textures of the clovers, the texture of the Parva, and then it'll take our eye to the back at that highlight point, which will ultimately be framed by the taller Cyperus Helferi. So after about an hour and a half of planting that, it's time to finish our build by filling in the foreground. And this foreground will fully consist of Hemianthus Cuba, one of the tiniest, tightest, most compact foreground plants in the hobby. So this plant does have a reputation for being difficult. However, if you're running RO water or if you have naturally soft water, and as long as you're running CO2, it'll do just fine. And once it's settled in, tends to be one of the easier plants to maintain. So we're filling in the entire foreground and sort of feathering our way to the midground with that Hemianthus Cuba. You want to break it up into tiny pieces and then just plant and spread as much as you can. The more cups you have to work with, the larger pieces you can use, but if you're on a tight budget, you can get by with just a few cups by spreading out tiny little fragments of the tissue culture cup. So with all of our plants in place, it's time to get the CO2 installed. Every aquarium plant in this hobby is going to benefit from the addition of pressurized CO2. However, some plants will do okay or great without it. It's important that you do your research and know the difficulty of the plants that you're working with. Over at Team Boost Plant, we really like working with CO2, so we're going to be installing it on here, and we're also working with some advanced plants in this case. So if we didn't use CO2, we might run some risk of melting and failure to thrive. We're working with the UNS CO2 canister as well as the UNS regulator. So we're going to get that all installed, add some water to the built-in bubble counter. This allows you to set the bubbles per second of the CO2, which is essentially how much CO2 you're pumping into your system. And then we're going to connect that to a tiny little Aquario Neo diffuser. This will create tiny little micro bubbles that'll get spread out by the outflow of the filter and spread all over the aquarium, giving the plants exactly what they need. So with the CO2 in place, it's time to set our photo period. We're setting our Chihiros light for 7 hours a day, and the CO2 is programmed to turn on 2 hours before the photo period starts, and then it will turn off 2 hours before the photo period ends. Here's the tank 2 weeks after planting. You can see things are beginning to fill in really nicely, and here it is 4 weeks later. So notice the significant growth that's happened. It's really important during those first few days of running your aquarium that you dial in your CO2 properly, and we recommend using a CO2 drop checker for this. The drop checker solution should turn from blue, which indicates 0 parts per million of CO2, to lime green by the time your photo period starts. So thank you so much for joining us on the first video in this aquascaping build series for the UNS 90S. We've got lots more videos in this series to come, but we want to hear from you. If this was your build, what fish, shrimp, and snails would you add to this beautiful tank? It's about 48 gallons, so there's a ton of room for a big school of fish, so we'd love to hear what species you have in mind. If you like our content, like the vid, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification for more. Now get out there and create something beautiful.